Hey guys, Navonod on No Limit Hold'em. I think I've got my microphone settings figured out now, hopefully. So as long as there's no weird thing that happens as I'm loading this onto YouTube, then we've got it. So I've been getting a lot of people in the comments and on my email and even in the poker class or within the group of students that I work with and the study group that I work with, to do something like a course. Like people want to have some sort of a way to uh, stay on track. They want to know, there's people that have voiced a concern to me that it's not that easy to know which videos to watch in what order and how to kind of stay on course. So I decided to do this, and this first video might go a little bit long. Hopefully, it's not going to be too long. I guess you know by the time you open it. But this is just going to be an overview, and I want to show you what the first few courses are going to be about. But this is what the entire system is going to be about. We're going to get into all of this stuff and probably a lot more, but we're definitely going to look into these things because these are all things I think are very important. You have to learn to think in ranges and equity, know what you're targeting when you're bluffing, when you're value betting, understand when it's right to be something like balanced and when it's better to take an exploitative approach, what the difference is, how to figure out how to do that, thinking in terms of mistakes and avoiding inducing mistakes, using the fundamental theorem of poker and game theory optimal play to sort of guide your decision process, the idea of using that Navonod's line, if you've seen that. If not, it's like just a way to really very quickly go through and frame your hand by relative hand value and adjust your own relative hand value based on your opponent's mistake propensity. Learn how to bet based on um, what type of aggressive ranges you're going to have, whether you have a range advantage and you're just going to bet everything, so you should be using a smaller sizing, or if you're going to have a polarized betting range where you might want to go a little bit bigger. And what does bigger and smaller even mean? What is it relative to? How much does it change based on the individual types of flops? And I guess that was the universe telling me it was time to move on. So yeah, basic no limit hold'em. This is one of the videos. The first video we're going to do within this series, outside of this introduction, obviously. We're going to talk about pre-flop open ranges. Why do we open? What hands do we open? Why do we open this hand and not that not that hand rather? And the theoretical foundations upon which we build and construct ranges by position, and how bet size, open size, and open range sort of go together. That you need one to solve for the other, but they don't necessarily have a causal relationship. And in other words, within the game space of no limit hold'em strategy, there's no element called time. So, well, at least not in a lot of the well. Okay, when you're trying to figure out what range should I use and what sizing should I use, those are two factors or attributes that go together. One does not cause the other. Time doesn't work that way inside the strategic game space of no limit hold'em. The only time that there is within the game space has to do with pot geometric. Well, it's the basic idea that if we see two spots in a hand, if the pot has grown, then we know that's later on in the hand. But outside of that, there's no arrow of time inside of the kind of mathematics of no limit hold'em. Then knowing what to open is very important, and if you've done any classes with me or watched a lot of my videos, you know that I'm not really big on, or if you've done sessions with me, I'm not big on telling you what hands you should open and what hands you shouldn't open from what position. If you ask me, I'll tell you my opinion, and sometimes it'll come up in conversation, but I would much rather explain why we open the hands we open and what factors are going to dictate that, and let you learn how to think for yourself. In a lot of ways, that's what this course is going to be about, is learning how to think for yourself, because metagame trends change. Poker evolves, no limit hold'em especially. It evolves, and the players do different things for different reasons. But if you're just following the crowd, then you're going to be one of those players that, like, for example, finds out or hears or realizes and knows that it's common knowledge that you should not ever flat call. Uh, well, what's the latest one? There was a time when people thought like you should always just be opening a super wide range from the button, and players realized that they should not be flat calling like 3 times the big blind open raises from the blinds. So it was standard for a while for players to defend their blinds by 3 betting or folding. Um, and the players that were really understanding this and really had their minds around why these things are the way they are figured out that if their opponents were always just going to 3 bet or fold, then they don't need to use a 3x open. And so they were able to exploit their opponents by using very small open raise sizes in late position, where really the answer should be, or the adjustment should be, that the blinds should start flatting an awful lot and not re-raising or folding very often. And so they were able to generate some serious edge there, because the players knew that they shouldn't be flatting uh, when they were facing a late position open out of the blinds, but they didn't know why they shouldn't be flatting. Um, so the reason was that it had something to do with the raise size, we'll say. So the players that really understood it were able to take advantage of that by using a min raise and still getting their opponents to not flat, which is really bad. And nowadays, even a lot of players are saying things like, almost nobody turns a profit flat calling 3 bets out of position. And there was a time when that was probably true. But now the people that are in the know can take advantage of their lack of knowledge and understanding, by 3 betting very small with a wide range in position and still basically getting that same result where their opponent's just going to 4-bet or fold. And if you can do that for a small sizing, then your opponent's never calling when they should call, and they're often raising when they shouldn't raise and folding when they shouldn't fold. So I don't want to do that. I don't want you to do that. I want you to figure out and understand the roots, not the leaves. We don't have to count all the leaves if we know the root. If we look at this tree's root, we know it's a maple root, then we don't have to go and count every leaf on the tree. We know that all the leaves are maple leaves, right? So let's learn the roots. That's the idea here. And it just is important to understand why we would continue and with what hands and what positions and in what way. Should we 3-bet a linear range or a merged, yeah, like or a polarized range, and should we be balanced or bluff heavy or value injected? When to squeeze, when to isolate, when to overlimp, and when to have some hands that are going to call, but then when they get squeezed, they're going to come back over the top. Like it's back raising if you're not familiar with the terminology. Then we're going to go into the second video that's going to be bridging the gap between pre-flop and post-flop, and what is that which bridges the gap. And I think what really bridges the gap between pre-flop and post-flop play is the continuation bet. Now, it's not always going to be the case that there will be a continuation bet, and if you're pre-flop raiser, you shouldn't always make a continuation bet, even in position, even when you're checked to, even heads up, whether you have a value hand or a bluff or showdown value. There's going to be some times where it makes sense to check your entire range back. There's going to be times when it makes sense to bet your entire range, and there's going to be times when it makes sense to polarize your attack range. And that, I mean, c-bet like your very strong hands and your not so strong hands, and check back your middle strength hands. And it's really important to be able to identify which spots are which. If you can identify what boards hit your range harder and when you should be the attacker and the aggressor, or when you should be the caller or defender, that's going to be a massive advantage. If you can figure out in a glance, looking at the flop, whose flop is that? And by knowing whose flop it is, okay, well, this is my opponent's flop. He checked to me. I should check back. It's like even if you have like top pair with a reasonable kicker, if your opponent has like way the best of it in terms of he's got a super range advantage. He's got the nut advantage and he's got the frequent strength advantage. Then maybe you don't want to just like mindlessly throw out C bets, especially with hands that are likely to be in pretty good shape right till they bet and get raised, right? In a situation where your opponent has a lot of incentive to raise because he's going to have a wide value range and therefore be able to rep a lot of bluffs. We're going to learn how to size our C-bets and what factors go into that. When does it make sense to lead into pre-flop raiser as pre-flop caller out of position, aka donk into the raiser, when to check raise, when to check and call, when to check and fold, when it makes sense to have a balanced range, when it maybe doesn't make so much sense to balance. We're going to learn how to figure, based on the indifference equations, what percent of our range needs to do what, and what things we do or don't do that incentivize our opponent to, say, c-bet or stab turn after we take a non-procedural check back, things of that nature. That's going to be on the second video, bridging the gap between pre-flop and post-flop, the continuation bet. We'll talk about floating, we'll talk about double floating, we'll talk about dubbing, but we're only going to be talking about those things with regard to how the double barrel and floats and the incentivizations, when the way that our opponent's playing is incentivizing us to do a one and done strategy, c-bet and shut down, or when we're incentivized to do a lot of double barreling, or when we're incentivized to double barrel some of the time, and what some of those cards might look like, and how the future equity distributions could change the percents that we want to c-bet on the flop. Like, just as an example, maybe we have a hand like Jack 10 of spades, and the board comes 9, the flop comes 9 of spades, 6 of diamonds, 2 of clubs. It's like, we don't have a tremendous amount on there, but we've got 2 overcards and a backdoor straight flush draw. And if we know our opponent does float a lot, but then he also folds an awful lot to double barrels, then we really have a lot of incentive to c-bet hands that have a pretty reasonable chance of improving to something that you can profitably double barrel. So that might be a situation where you want to double barrel, but when you have like that same Jack 10 suited hand and the flop comes like Queen, 6-5, rainbow, and you have none of it, maybe it's a little bit different then, yeah, it's probably not the perfect example, but these are the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about on, we're going to talk about how future actions are going to change the way we ought to proceed on this decision point. The way that turns and rivers are going to play out, that has to have an effect on the way that we play this decision point. Then that's going to lead us into an entire video on nothing but playing the turn. And this is where we're really going to get into attacking capped ranges, when it makes sense to take the same action with our entire range so that we're not splitting our range. Because if you don't split your range, your opponent can't read your hand, right? But sometimes the reason your opponent can read your range is because for you to not split your range, you'd be pissing away a bunch of value, right? Or EV. So like when to dub for value, when to bluff dub, when to think about taking the triple barrel. Because again, what we are planning on doing on the river has to affect the decisions that we make on the turn. So we're going to be getting into those things when we get into this video on playing the turn. We're going to identify what cards are good for us, what cards are good for our opponent. We're going to get into the use of some of the tools in our kit. Like, I don't know if I'm going to use like any of the solvers, but for sure Aqualab and Flopzilla. Everybody should have Flopzilla. Everybody should have some kind of a HUD. Everybody should have Aqualab. I guess you can do just about everything with Flopzilla that you can do with Aqualab. Although I'm not sure that's true. I digress. So at this point, we should be thinking when we get to the turn, we really ought to have a good idea of how we're going to play rivers also, right? In a lot of ways, the player who's best able to think moves ahead is going to have the highest ROI. But there's a lot of places where we can get an edge, even in pretty tough metagames where few players are really just giving money away. There's a lot of things that I think regulars just do very wrong. One of those things is they don't think enough for themselves. They don't take the time, they don't put the work in to understand all of these ideas, and so they're more or less just going along with the crowd and doing whatever the crowd says to do. And in my book, that's the textbook definition of a bad rag. And if you can beat the bad rags and you can beat the fish, then you can beat poker, right? So, I mean, I could just entitle this video series "How Not to Be a Bad Rag," you know, talking about like how to set stacks up in order, or how to bet in such a way, or take lines that lead us to the ability to, or the inability to allow our opponent to set the stacks up so that we can, or set the pot up in such a way, using sizing, thinking ahead, thinking in terms of like SPRs, which is stack to pot ratio, bet sizing, what we're targeting, what we're going after, how often is our opponent going to raise, and what does that look like, and how does that change the stack math, so that when we have a set and our opponent's got a good second best hand, we have a really good chance of busting him, of stacking him, or doubling through. And when we have a pretty good but kind of I don't know, not amazing hand, how do we get the most mileage out of that hand while at the same time making it very difficult for the traps and value parts of our opponent's range to set up to get our stack, you know, like pot control lines. And we're going to talk about how position comes into that, how to try to set up situations where we can create this polar versus bluff catcher scenario where we have a polarized range, our opponent has a bluff catcher, and we can set stacks up and use bet sizing and set our ranges up to construct a strategy that our opponent really just is indifferent between folding and calling with his bluff catchers on the river, which in terms of pure EV just means we've effectively captured the entire size of the pot no matter what our opponent does. We're going to talk about indifference, defense frequencies, Beluga theorem and how good it is, and when it breaks down, and when it's great, when it's awful, and my personal twist on it, the Beluga's a bitch theorem, whereby we can take that idea of Beluga theorem and turn it on its head by finding good tags that take pot control lines, but maybe before they've been able to identify us, we identify them. And we know that they like to bet thin for value, but will fold to raises, specifically and especially when those raises come on the turn. Well, then we're going to start value raising rivers and value raising flops, but we're going to be very bluff heavy on our turn raises. And a lot of players won't be ready for that. In fact, well, I mean, this is something we're going to get into in the video, but it's my experience and it's my opinion that if you're going to bluff against a reasonably good player today, you should do it on the turn and sometimes on the river. I think the worst place to bluff, and so probably the best place to value raise, is it's on the flop. You know, players are used to that. Players realize that a lot of people are check raising draws and raising their like backdoor straight draws with overcard, like, you know, like mediocre kind of bluff equity, like mediocre equity hands make pretty good bluffs on flops, except that everybody knows that. And so we're going to be talking about how to do that, when to take non-procedural lines on the turn, you know, to kind of break the rhythm of the hand, not just for the sake of breaking rhythm, but because sometimes it makes sense to do that, and most regulars are not used to dealing with that. They don't know how to handle it when you check call flop and lead turn right into them, which I don't think is a reason in and of itself to just take non-procedural lines because our opponents are bad against them, but it's definitely incentive to learn, or you maybe could look at it as a good incentive to learn when it actually does make sense to break rhythm and take a non-procedural line. And then eventually we're going to get to river play. And I thought about releasing these videos in reverse order because honestly, a lot of times off table, I think it makes a lot of sense to sort of reverse engineer our lines when we're doing line checks and when we're kind of planning and thinking how we're going to take certain hands with certain ranges on certain runouts in future. Because in a way, you kind of need to know how to solve these river spots before you can really plan your turn strategy. And you've got to have a pretty good turn strategy before you can design a good flop strategy. Um, and if you don't know how to play the flop, then I guess you can still learn how to do okay pre-flop, but you're never going to really know how to play pre-flop unless you know how to play the flop. And you can't know how to play the flop unless you have a good strategy for dealing with a lot of turns, and you definitely cannot figure out a great turn strategy or how to deal with a lot of turns till you know how to set up a river range. And plus, river ranges are simpler. I mean, river play is the simplest, I think. Um, you could argue that pre-flop play is simpler, but I don't think that's the case. I think pre-flop play is only simpler in the sense that the mistakes you make are usually not as costly, and that you can make a pretty good case for a lot of different strategies because nobody really knows. I mean, you can't solve pre-flop until you have literally solved the game of No Limit Hold'em. But on this river play situation, and the reason I did decide to do it at the end of this series is because you really can solve these situations. You can use you can use the indifference principle to exactly solve a lot of river situations. Not all, I mean, but you can. I can show you. I can do a lot of. Um, well, I can give you a lot of the information and some examples and get you um, doing this at a relatively high level in a relatively low amount of time. But I think it's more technical and mathematical than the other videos. And so I think it does kind of make sense to leave it at the end. Also, by the time we're talking about river play, we're going to also be talking about how to construct our ranges on turns and also flops to end up in situations where we have a good um, river strategy. Like, especially when we have managed to set up a polar versus bluff catcher situation and kind of put our opponent in the vice, put them in it. But we're going to talk about what's our opponent repping, what are we repping, what kind of sizing, are we polarizing, are we going to be betting a merged range, should we be like the bluff catcher in a situation, or should we be the bluffer, and so on and so forth, how to make our opponent indifferent between bluffing and value betting when they have a polarized range, and how to maybe kind of disincentivize our opponent or kind of get them in spots where it's not so easy for them to put us in a bluff catcher situation. And then when we are in a bluff catching situation, how should we choose our calling range? Like, what bluff catcher should we use? And how to bluff raise rivers. Because right now, river bluffing against decent regs is pretty amazing. That's been my experience, and I'm gonna share some of my thoughts and ideas on that. So, yeah, I guess that's gonna do it for this primer. Thank you for watching. I'm pretty damn busy right now, but definitely feel free to ask about coaching and the COP program. Sorry, I don't. Well, yeah, it's the COPP, which is the Complete Overpowered Poker course system. COPS, maybe COPS. The Complete Overpowered Poker System. I like it. COPS. Let's do it that way. Yeah, bad boys. And whatnot. It's all about nerfing them cops. Dig it. Alright, till next time, guys. Navonod on No Limit Hold'em. I'm doing this. So comments, below, please. Let me know what you think about the idea. Tell me if the sound is good. God, I hope it is. I've put a lot of time and money and effort and energy into getting the sound settings to be at least okay. So, yeah, hopefully this is it. What's interesting is I'm back to not using an aftermarket microphone. So, yeah, yeah, that's if you knew how many I'd tried and how much energy and effort I've put into that, um, you would understand why that's frustrating and comical. But if this video sounds okay, give me the thumbs up, guys, and like and subscribe and whatnot. DonDoust at gmail.com if you'd like to talk to me about coaching or maybe about the strategy group. Until next time, Navonod on no limit. Hold them good. Quote. It's quote. It probably sounds like quote. Quote. Um, exclamation. No. Luck. End quote. Or exclamation point. End quote. There you go. Navonod on no limit. Hold them over and out.